Hi, third graders. Let's work on another lesson on determining the central message. You're going to need the story, The Goose That Laid the Golden Egg, and your Grasshopper and the Ant stories. If you've picked up your red folder, they should be in there. If not, these are links in Schoology, so you can open them and follow along. All right, let's get started. Okay, I want you to think back. What does central message mean? All right, if you said something like the central message is the lesson or the moral of the story that the author wants us as the reader to learn, then you are right. It is the big picture about a lesson that we learn for our lives. And central means that the message is for everybody. So not just the characters in the story, but for us in our lives. So that brings us to our learning target today, which is today we will determine the central message of a fable. Remember, a fable is a type of story that usually has animals as characters by using the key details from the text. So back when we practiced recounting the story, we were finding the important details of the story so that we can get used to picking out what's important and what's not. Well, guess what? That's going to come in handy as we try to find the central message of the fables this week. So we're going to practice together with this story, The Goose That Laid the Golden Eggs. If you have your story handy, also grab a pen or a pencil so that you can underline the key details in the story as we go through it. So let's practice together by doing a close read. So remember, when we do close reading, we read it more than one time. And sometimes that when we read it multiple times, we kind of just scan or look quickly through the text for certain information. But the first read, we read to see what the story is about. So we read very carefully the first time. So let's start at the beginning. I will read it with you. Follow along with me. A farmer and his wife went to a fair in the next town. They wanted to buy a new goose to eat the weeds in their garden. They found a large, plump goose and took her home. They didn't know that this was their lucky day. The next morning, the farmer's wife went to collect eggs. She found a big yellow egg in the goose's nest. She picked up the strange egg and took it to her husband. "Look at this egg the goose laid," she said. "It is very heavy and very yellow." The farmer took the egg. His mouth fell open. "This egg is made of gold," he said. The goose laid a golden egg every day. The farmer and his wife grew very rich from selling the eggs, and they grew very, very greedy. "Let's cut open the goose. Then we can get all of the golden eggs at one time," said the farmer. But when they cut the goose open, there was no gold. The goose was just like all geese inside. Now the greedy farmer and his wife had no more golden eggs, and they didn't have a goose to eat the weeds in the garden. The farmer and his wife kept buying geese. They wanted to find a new goose that laid golden eggs, but they were out of luck. Okay, so that is our first read. Now we know what the story is about. We got some information on the characters in the story and how the story develops in the middle and then how it ends. So the second read, when we read it again, we're going to be looking for the character or characters who have a problem. Now, a problem is not always something bad, but something that causes other events in the story to happen. So when we look through this story, we're going to have to look to see if there was something that happened that caused the other events to occur after that. And then the third time, and also we need to see what happens to the character at the end. Then the third time that we read this, we need to look for evidence on what lesson the character learns. So the main character of the story is going to learn something from his problem or her problem. And then we need to see what can we learn from the character. So that would be the central message. And we're going to use information from the story to fill in our graphic organizer. And the reason we call it a graphic organizer, it's something that we can see that helps us organize our thoughts. Because sometimes it's hard to organize what we're thinking inside our head unless we write it down. So that's why it's called a graphic organizer. All right, so let's see how we're going to put that information into the graphic organizer. Okay, so you should also have a copy of this graphic organizer in your red folder, but if you haven't picked up your red folder, you can just recreate this on a blank piece of paper. It's just important to have it written down. You don't necessarily need this piece of paper. Okay, let's look back in the story. So we already did our first read. We read through it to see what it was about. So the second read is we're going to be looking for that problem that the character had. And again, remember, a problem doesn't always have to be bad. It's like the main event that causes other things to happen. So I'm going to read the first three paragraphs again, and I want you to see if you can figure out what the problem of the story is. A farmer and his wife went to a fair in the next town. They wanted to buy a new goose to eat the weeds in their garden. They found a large, plump goose and took her home. They didn't know that this was their lucky day. The next morning, the farmer's wife went to collect eggs. She found a big yellow egg in the goose's nest. She picked up the strange egg and took it to her husband. "Look at this egg," the goose laid. She said, "It is very heavy and very yellow." The farmer took the egg. His mouth fell open. "This egg is made of gold." Okay, so we already know that the characters in the story are the farmer and the wife and this goose. But what is the problem that the characters have? Remember, it's not necessarily bad. All right, if you said that the farmer and his wife found an egg made of gold, then you are correct. That actually is a problem. The reason it's a problem is it's the start of the other events in the story. So even though we sometimes think problems are bad things, this may not necessarily be a bad thing. Sometimes it's actually a good thing, but it does cause other things in the story to happen. So on your graphic organizer, we're going to write down, the farmer found a golden egg that his new goose had laid. That is the problem. And then I underlined it in the text. So go ahead and pause the video while you write that down and you underline the evidence from the text. Okay, so now that we have the problem, what happens after the problem? We need to go back into the story. So I'm going to start in the fourth paragraph, and I'm going to see what happened after that. The goose laid a golden egg every day. Well, that happened, but if we didn't say that, would it still make sense? Maybe. Let's keep reading. The farmer and his wife grew very rich from selling the eggs, and they grew very, very greedy. That's also a problem. That could also be the problem that you would put in key detail number 1 in that box, that they had these eggs every day and then they grew greedy. Now that is a bad problem. So if you wrote that down, I can take that as well. I'm going to read a little bit more to see what happens. Let's cut open the goose. Then we can get all of the golden eggs out at one time, said the farmer. But when they cut the goose open, there was no gold. The goose was just like all geese inside. I think that's very important to know, that they grew greedy, they cut the goose open, and now they found out there is not gold inside that goose. So I'm going to underline that they grew greedy and that they cut open the goose so that they can get all of the eggs out at one time. So now that I've underlined that, I'm going to write it down in my box for detail number 2. The farmer and his wife grew greedy, so they cut open the goose to get all the golden eggs at once. So pause the video and write that down. All right, let's look at the third key detail. Now the greedy farmer and his wife had no more golden eggs, and they didn't have a goose to eat the weeds in the garden. The farmer and his wife kept buying geese. They wanted to find a new goose that laid golden eggs, but They were out of luck. So how does the story end? This is the third key detail. Well, I know at the end, the goose was just like any other goose inside, and they now don't have a goose to eat the weeds in their garden. They keep looking for another goose to lay golden eggs, but they're out of luck. So we're going to write this down for our third key detail. The goose did not have gold inside, and now they didn't have a goose to eat their weeds, and they never found a goose that laid golden eggs. So that is how the story ended. So that is the ending. So pause the video and write down this third key detail. Okay, now what we need to do is we need to take all of the information that we put in these key detail boxes and think about what we can learn from the farmer and his wife. What is the central message of the story that teaches us a lesson that we can learn? So I know that golden eggs are not real, but I do know that being greedy is something that is real. So if you are greedy, that's not good, because look what happened to the farmer. They thought that they could get even more. They weren't happy with what they have. They cut the goose open and now they have nothing. So that could be a lesson that I can learn from my life, is make sure that you are happy or thankful for what you have. That's a lesson that the wife, or the farmer and his wife, should have been thankful for just getting one golden egg a day, and they should not have been greedy. Don't wish that you could have more, because then you might lose a good thing. So these are some examples of the central message that you could have come up with. So if you have one that fits with the story that is different from mine, that's fine. Go ahead and write it down in your central message box, or you can write down the one I have. Now it's going to be your turn to practice. You're going to need the story, The Grasshopper and the Ants. Again, this is in your red reading folder that if you haven't picked it up, you can also look in the link in Schoology, click on it, and you can read it right there. Or if you have picked up your folder, then this story is in your folder. You will also need the central message graphic organizer, but again, you can make one on your own on a blank piece of paper. So what you're going to do for your assignment is you're going to do a close read. Remember, when you do a close read, you read it more than one time with a different purpose for each read. So the first time we're reading, we're just reading to find out what this story is about. The second time you go through it, I want you to look for the problem and the important events that happen after the problem occurs. And then the third read, you're going to pay attention to the ending. How does this story end? What lesson does the main character learn from the story? And then what can we learn from the character? That is the central message. Remember, the central message is the lesson that we can learn for our lives. So what you're going to do is write down those 3 key details in the box, starting with the boxes, starting with the problem in the first box. Then the second one is something important that happened that will help you find out what lesson the character is starting to learn. And then the third one is what happens at the end. When you take all of that information together and you figure out what lesson that character learned, what is the central message that we can apply to our lives? And then you'll write that in the box up here. So once you have it written down, onliners, you're going to go into Schoology and you're going to type in your information from this graphic organizer into the assignment in Schoology so I can see what you have written down. And then you can put this graphic organizer back into your red folder after you've filled it out and leave it in there until we do our next folder exchange, and then I can collect it from you then. All right. So our review of today's lesson, today we determined how to find the central message of a fable by using the key details in a text. If you have any trouble, let me know. Good job, boys and girls. Keep up the good work.